wildlife and endangered species from pesticides. Josh Vincent leads NCAP's Healthy People and campaign, which focuses on eliminating harmful pesticides used in places such as K-12 schools, public housing, landscaped areas, such as and other places where people may be at risk. Josh is a graduate of the University of Oregon and has worked as an organizer on environmental issues since 2006. So we're really fortunate to have Josh here today to chat with us, and I look forward to hearing his presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to Josh.
Great, thank you very much. And I also want to thank Bailey for putting this to speak with you, and it's my pleasure to do it. Just to give you a little bit more background on NCAP and sort of our involvement with school IPM, which is something I'm going to be speaking primarily about this morning. We were also involved back in 2009 during the campaign to get the school IPM law passed. There were many organizations that were involved with that. So we we're working in conjunction with them, but we have been very active on school IPM ever since then. And it's a pretty large program area for us. It's really a priority. And so that's where we have put a lot of our focus over the last few years. I'm going to give you sort of an overview of what the talk is about. Before I get into school IPM and what the school IPM law looks like here in Oregon, I want to talk a little bit about why that's important. So we'll go through, sort of in generally, what am I talking about when I'm talking about pesticides? Why should you care about pesticides? What are the concerns around pesticide use? We'll talk about pesticides and their impacts on children and children's special vulnerability to pesticide exposure. And then we'll get into integrated pest management, or IPM, why we like IPM, why that's a preferred method here. Then we'll look at the school IPM law and how that maybe affects you and your school. And we'll chat about some ways that you can improve IPM at your school and make sure that you're in compliance with the law itself. And then throughout this, as they mentioned, if you have questions, you can type them in, and we'll try to address as many of those as possible once I get to the end of the presentation here. So to begin with, just so that we're all talking about the same thing, I like to speak a little bit about what pesticides actually are. The term pesticide includes things like herbicides, insecticides, fungicides. All of those things are covered by the umbrella term pesticide. Refers to any agent that is designed specifically for the effective use for controlling pests. Before I came to do this work, I had kind of a limited understanding of what a pesticide was. I thought generally it was just an insecticide, but actually all of these things are covered by the term pesticide. These are some common ones, things that you see in the home and garden stores. There are obviously some that are available for the general public to use that you don't need a special license to obtain, and then there are some that you do need a special license to obtain, but all of these things are pesticides. There's some other things that are pesticides that are maybe less well known. There are things like botanical oils, minerals, microbes, biological organisms, these things like nematodes and Bacillus thuringiensis, and a lot of the stuff that's used in organic agriculture now, those are pesticides. Things like vinegar can be used as pesticides, and these are, not really the ones that we're concerned as much about. In fact, a lot of these are fairly low toxicity, good alternatives to conventional chemical pesticides. When NCAP is speaking about pesticides, or when we talk about alternatives to pesticides, it's really the conventional synthetic chemical agents that have either long persistence in the environment or some kind of complex molecular structure that is really toxic. These are the kinds of things that we want to try to find better alternatives for. These are your organophosphate pesticides, organochlorines, pretty toxic stuff. The reasons that they're concerning, number one, just kind of obviously, is that they're engineered to be toxic. They're designed to kill things. So there's an inherent level of risk when you're using them. Some pesticides are broad spectrum, meaning that they're poisonous to a wide range of organisms. And then others are more targeted, and so their effects tend to be limited to certain species or certain kinds of things. But even in those cases, most pesticides, even the more selective ones, can have impacts on non-target organisms or things that aren't the pest. And so that could be the pesticide applicator. It could be children in a school. It could be farm workers. Anyone who comes into contact with the chemical. Another reason that they're concerning is that they aren't very thoroughly tested. When the EPA registers a pesticide, they rely fairly heavily on environmental and safety studies that are provided by the companies that are manufacturing the pesticides. Since those companies eventually would like for their products to end up on the market, there's a bit of an incentive, we think, for the negative health and environmental impacts to get underreported or kind of marginalized or overlooked. They're also often granted something that's called conditional registration. This is a process whereby the EPA says it's okay to go ahead and manufacture and sell a pesticide product even if it hasn't been thoroughly tested. They don't have all the data that they would usually require before registering a product. The idea here is that if it comes to light that the product is dangerous or if there are bad effects that are later on noticed, the EPA can withdraw that registration and cancel the pesticide. But a lot of products are already on the market, are already being used, and we're not really even sure what the impacts of exposure to those chemicals, what those impacts are. Earlier this year, the Natural Resource Defense Council did an investigation and found that at least 2/3 of pesticides that are currently registered have been registered under this conditional registration provision. And the EPA did its own internal review and found that the conditional registration provision had been widely misused and that it was actually improperly issued in about 98% of cases. So there's a lot of stuff out there that's being sprayed, and we're just not really sure what it does. We don't really like that. When information does become available, what we find is that pesticide exposure in general creates some pretty serious health problems. Cancer is the big one. You see things like leukemia and lymphomas having much higher rates among people who are exposed to pesticides. But there are many other health impacts. These range from cognitive and attention deficit disorders to things like Parkinson's disease. And I think recently even diabetes had been linked to toxic chemical exposure. Looking at, just to flip ahead here really quick, this is one of the most common chemicals on the market, glyphosate. It's the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup. This is something that's been marketed for years as biodegradable and low toxicity and environmentally benign. But when you look at the health and safety testing data, what you find is that the exposure to this stuff causes all kinds of acute problems, skin rashes, nausea, headaches, eye irritation, asthmatic type symptoms. But in longer term studies, they found that it actually causes genetic damage and that it can cause mutations and birth difficulties in lab animals and things like that. So, and this is one of the most widely used ones on the market. Now, other issues that are just, kind of larger, maybe these are more tied to agriculture and less to urban pesticide use, is that pesticides create water quality issues. USGS has found pesticides in 97% of the waterways that they've tested for them. This is just about everywhere they look. They tend to find pesticides, and not just at trace amounts. In many of the cases, I think it's something like 80 to 85% of those cases, the levels of pesticides that they're finding are actually in excess of what the health and environmental safety thresholds are, what the EPA would allow. And then finally, pesticides are concerning and sort of disappointing because they don't actually solve pest problems. They're fairly good at treating the symptoms of pest problems, which are your pest populations that you have present. But ultimately, your pests come back, and so you have to spray again, and then your pests come back again, and you have to spray again. And this is something that gets referred to as the pesticide treadmill. It's sort of a self-perpetuating process where you're putting yourself and you're putting those around you at risk, and you're compromising the healthfulness of your environment and not even really getting to the bottom of what's causing your pest issues. And so we'll talk about that more when we get to IPM and why IPM is really good at getting at the root causes of pest issues. So children and pesticides, this is something that really forms the foundation for why we get involved with school IPM and really working to reduce pesticide use at school. It's because kids spend a lot of their time at school, 7, 8 hours a day, most of the year. And when pesticides are used at school, that obviously puts children at risk for exposure. And this is significant because kids are more affected by pesticide exposure than adults are. And there's several reasons why. One is that because their bodies are metabolically different from adults, it's pretty much known that they respirate more and they consume more food and water, proportionally more food and water than adults do. And so when there are pollutants present in the air and the food and the water, the kids have a proportionally higher exposure to those pollutants than adults. They also don't have fully developed bodies, so they're less able to cope with toxic exposures when they occur. There are also crucial developmental stages throughout childhood. These are called, various different things. Developmental windows is, I think, the World Health Organization term for it. But when children are exposed to toxic chemicals during these developmental stages, can actually seriously alter the child's course of growth. And there are what you hear often in connection with this is the endocrine disrupting chemicals, the compounds that are present in some pesticides and actually also in a lot of plastics and children's toys. These things can mimic hormones when they interact with the body, and it can confuse normal developmental processes at that age. Now, to make this a little bit more complicated, kids tend to be more likely to become exposed to pesticides just by virtue of what their common behaviors are. When you get kids crawling around on the floor or putting things in their mouths, which most kids do, that puts them at a higher risk for coming into contact with pesticides if pesticides have been used. Now, these risks are pretty well acknowledged by groups like the EPA. The American Academy of Pediatrics actually released a report, I believe it was early last year, acknowledging all of these risks that children have as a result of pesticides. I won't read you these quotes, but they're essentially saying the same thing. The World Health Organization actually has a pretty good slideshow on this that you can access through their website. It's a teaching tool, I think, for teachers that I link to a little bit later on. So I'll make sure that you all get the links to that. The point is that kids are not pests, notwithstanding some maybe undesirable classroom behavior from time to time, but they're not pests. We don't want to expose them to pesticides. So the alternative that we work to implement in schools is integrated pest management, IPM, as it's commonly referred to. IPM is a comprehensive approach that weaves together many different techniques to actually eliminate the causes of pest problems, not just the pests themselves. Now, this is a graphic from the University of Nevada that kind of outlines the general approach here. You can see that prevention and sanitation make up a really big part of IPM, and we'll kind of get into detail on some of those strategies. But it also includes things like physical and mechanical controls, not just pesticides. Biological controls with regard to agriculture, again, maybe more so than urban IPM. But again, not just pesticides. It doesn't ban pesticides. It doesn't totally exclude them from the process usually, but it does tend to reserve them as a last resort and really put a priority on the strategies that are not going to compromise people's health or the greater environment. There's, I think, a helpful graphic here that sort of gets at the underlying philosophy. This represents kind of the three pillars of what any organism needs to survive. You got to have food, you got to have water, and you have to have habitat. And so these are essentially the same things that pests are looking for when they move into an environment. If you can deprive them of getting one or more of these things, ideally all three, then you've solved your pest issue. And this is really kind of the heart of what IPM is about, is removing habitat, or it's actually more commonly referred to as harborage for pests, and then preventing them from accessing food and water sources. You get rid of these things, and then they have no desire to be where you are. So just to kind of go back to this chart here, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what an IPM process looks like, and then we'll talk about what is actually mandated by the law here in Oregon. Generally, when you start an IPM program, or if you're developing an IPM plan, what you want to do generally first is to set some action thresholds. And these are ways to kind of guide your decisions by establishing a point at which the presence of pest populations or the damage that's being caused by pests is sufficient to warrant some kind of a control response. It's often kind of assumed within conventional pest control programs that that control is necessary, but actually not all pests even require that you take action. Many organisms are fairly innocuous. You have sugar ants, for example, that don't really do much damage, and they may require no control response at all, other than just if you're annoyed by them. You could set a high action threshold for pests like that. For other pests, the action threshold might be pretty low. Rodents, for example, introduce several different kinds of health risks when they're present in an indoor environment, and so they generally require quick attention. Actually, the threshold for rodents indoors is zero, pretty much. I know it is here and in most places that I've seen. So monitoring becomes a crucial part of IPM as well. So if you're setting these action thresholds, you've got to know what pests you have and try to have some understanding of what levels their populations are at. Monitoring and this kind of identification of pests also removes the possibility that you're going to use pesticides when they're not really needed, or that you might use the wrong kind of pesticide. So it's actually a good sort of reduction tool in and of itself. Now, if you're monitoring and you meet your action thresholds, if you've got some action that's required, the next step within an IPM program is generally to explore your options for excluding or physically removing the pests. The techniques here, are different depending on what the pest is, but going back to rodents as an example, trapping is an example of a physical or a mechanical control that would be preferable to rodenticides. Not only, within an IPM context, not only because it avoids the potential of exposing people to, likely hazardous substances, but trapping is actually a better way to remove rodents from your building. There's a phenomenon that happens when rats eat poison bait, where they tend to crawl into floor spaces or wall voids or other areas that are hard to reach, and then they die in there, and then you've got another problem because you've got a dead rat in the ceiling or the wall or something that you have to deal with. And that's not only gross, but it attracts other pests. And so you have a kind of snowball effect there, where then you have insects and other things that start coming into the building. So trapping is very effective for rodents. Can be effective for some kinds of insects as well. You have roach stations and things like that I think are actually the roach stations and roach baits are one of the only insecticides that are still allowed under the Oregon law. We'll get to that though. Other kind of physical exclusionary practices would be installing door sweeps or window screens, these kinds of pest proofing structural improvements. And, a lot of this stuff should be done kind of anyway as part of prevention. But if you actually do have a pest issue, you can start cutting back on the access that pests have to your building just by these kind of simple improvements. It's estimated that about 75% of all pest problems can be avoided just by doing stuff like that. And all of these kinds of low-risk techniques are the first step in control as part of an IPM program. Getting into the kind of last tier there of chemical use, it's really, I guess now this is a pretty good chance to transition in talking about Oregon's law, but there are only low-impact pesticides that are now allowed for schools to use, and part of the law requires that schools come up with a list of these low-impact pesticides for those occasions in which pesticide use is warranted. But let's go in order. I think just to kind of harken back to the background I gave you earlier, this bill was actually passed back in 2009. There was an implementation period of a couple of years where schools had time to sort of evaluate what their pest control practices were, what their staffing looked like, and come together with an IPM plan. Effective July 1 of last year, schools had to have this IPM plan in place and to be carrying out their pest control according to the plan. The plan requires that they have a IPM coordinator. This is a person who oversees those kind of pest proofing activities, the monitoring, any control actions. This would also be the person who monitors that list of low impact pesticides, make sure that is up to date. And I think that this position might look different for schools depending on budgets and depending on the size of the school. A lot of people wear multiple hats. I'm aware of, so that it may not be a single job. It may be something that that many people are involved with. But I think there has to be a designated coordinator. Now, the low impact pesticides, this is something that is maybe difficult to understand, but the toxicity is indicated by something that's called a signal word, and these are present on the pesticide labels. There are three that are commonly used: caution, which indicates a low toxicity; warning, which indicates moderate toxicity; and danger, which indicates a high toxicity. It's funny because I look at these and I'm not really sure which one is worse just by looking at caution, warning, and danger. But the Oregon law mentions specifically that for the low impact pesticide lists that schools have to maintain, products with warning and danger on their labels should not be included on those lists. These are the higher toxicity products. For example, this pesticide, you can see clearly on the label it says danger. This is not something that would be allowed for use in Oregon schools. Likewise, here on this one, you can see it's pretty clearly marked there. Now, pesticides can only be applied by a licensed applicator. So there's no more instances where teachers would keep a can of Raid in the classroom, or at least there's not supposed to be. Even if they are kind of, we would call them over-the-counter pesticide products, if they're not a product that you'd have to have a license to buy, you still don't apply them on campuses unless you are a licensed pesticide applicator. And this is something that is done with the idea that it's going to minimize erroneous uses or uses of the wrong pesticides. It's just kind of a way to keep the chemical use to a minimum and to make sure that all of the pesticide applications are recorded, because that's another thing that the law requires, is that schools keep records of what pesticides they're using, when they were used, what they were used for, those kinds of things. Looking at the responsibilities of IPM coordinators here in Oregon, ongoing each year, the coordinators have to receive at least 6 hours of training on IPM, as well as the Oregon revised statutes pertaining to school IPM. And there are trainings offered at least 2 or 3 times a year through Oregon State University that I'm aware of, and there may be others. And these are generally pretty easy to access. They also must conduct education and outreach to school staff. I think this is an important component because usually IPM becomes something of a team effort. Keeping the faculty and the staff at the schools up to date on what to look out for in terms of monitoring for pests, but also what to do in terms of good sanitation and really working to prevent pest issues in the first place. Keeping teachers and even students involved with those processes can really make a big difference. Obviously, the IPM coordinator oversees pest control actions and ensures that the IPM plan is followed. I mentioned this already, but they keep track of the notification requirements. If you're going to actually apply a pesticide in a school, It's required that you provide written notification in advance to the parents, to the teachers, to anyone who's going to be there in the vicinity of the campus, and then that you keep records of those pesticide applications. And then, of course, responding to the staff and parents with questions about IPM, what the school's pest management practices actually are, and dealing with the state and any kind of regulatory correspondence over the IPM law. And I don't actually think there's much of that, because the law is not perfect. When it passed back in 2009, it didn't have really funding attached to it. So there's not, as far as I'm aware of, a huge enforcement mechanism to ensure that schools are actually doing these things. It's kind of an honor system right now, and it's a project that NCAP and other organizations are going to move forward with, hoping to kind of continue to improve that law and to provide more resources for schools in the state. But it hasn't happened yet. It's a project ongoing. So some things to think about are, how your school measures up with IPM. What are you doing? What does your IPM plan look like? And what can be improved about it? You can see here things like recycling bins, food areas in school cafeterias or even staff lounges, storage areas. These are the kinds of places that sort of become ground zero for your indoor pests, whether they're rodents or roaches or ants. And again, a lot of it has to do with sanitation and really working to deprive access to that harborage and that food and water and the other things that pests are seeking out. Creating a culture at your school of minimizing these kinds of pest magnets is really the first step, and kind of a fun way to engage people, whether they're teachers or students, in projects to remove clutter around the school and to kind of tidy things up. Some other things. One thing that doesn't often get the attention it deserves is the impact that school landscapes can have on indoor pest issues. This picture is of some outdoor vegetation that actually touches the building of a school. And this provides a pathway for rodents and for insects to actually make their way onto the roof of the school and then down into the ventilation. And there's a lot of examples like this where you have vegetation up next to the building, whether they're trees or shrubs or other kinds of things like that provide harborage for pests and also a kind of conduit for them to get into the building. And so there are even outdoor projects just in terms of kind of revamping the landscape and certain kinds of practices to implement to improve the exclusion that you're practicing in your IPM plan. Some other things to think about are if, let's see, my notes mixed up here. Does my school have an IPM coordinator? Who is it? What can I do to help that person? What preventative steps have we taken to avoid pest problems? Are there ways to reduce clutter in classrooms and lockers? Are we dealing with food and food waste properly? One thing that we saw actually here in Eugene pretty recently was a school that, as a part of their Green Schools program, they had started a food waste and lunch waste composting on campus, which was awesome. But they had done it in such a way that they were actually attracting rodents and flies and gnats into one of the classrooms because their compost bin wasn't far enough away from the building to avoid those problems. And so if you have programs like that schools are initiating as a part of sustainability efforts, introducing some strategies like that, just to make sure that it's located away from the building, make sure that the compost is managed in a way that it attracts fewer pests. These are good things to do to kind of self-assess. Look at your school's pesticide list, their list of less toxic chemicals. Make sure that they actually are less toxic chemicals. Make sure that they're being used, only kind of in last resort situations. And last resort would be, if other mechanical options have failed, if the things that you've tried are not working, or if there's some kind of an emergency pest issue that represents a real health threat, like if you've got poisonous insects or reptiles that have appeared suddenly and you have little time or resources. I think those are things that constitute emergency measures and last resort situations. There's a lot of inside activities that you can engage in to stop pests from entering the schools. Again, I went over this a little bit earlier, but fixing your window screens, installing the brush type door sweeps on things like your doors that open to the outside, caulking on cracks and crevices around windows and other things like that where ants and other insects can get into the building. For food items that are stored, even food items that are stored in classrooms, like the dry noodles and things like that that are used for craft projects, making sure that those are sealed in sealed containers, not cardboard cartons or packaging that can be chewed through. Those kinds of things can make a big difference. Cleaning up in and under microwaves, under equipment in the kitchen where grease and crumbs can accumulate. I mean, all this is kind of standard stuff. I guess one thing to consider too is in Eugene, we at least haven't had a huge bed bug issue, but I know in other parts of the state, bed bugs have made their way into housing and even can be transmitted between students at schools. Bed bugs are really good at kind of hitchhiking on backpacks and coats and stuff like that. And so to avoid transferring bed bugs and lice even between students, there are things you can do in your classroom to kind of minimize on those kinds of pests. One of which is placing storage hooks or like cubbies to kind of place those far enough apart so that jackets and backpacks aren't touching. This makes it harder for pests to spread. Discourage children from sharing hats or helmets. Request that they put their jackets inside of backpacks when they're in storage. This is even better than hanging them somewhere where they can actually accidentally kind of contact each other. And then obviously you want to engage with parents on those kinds of issues too, to make sure that they're using, good, least toxic lice products if they do have lice issues, and to make sure that they're checking their kids weekly for that kind of stuff if it's been a problem at your school. I want to point you to some resources that we have online, and then I think I'll kind of open it up to questions and see maybe what I didn't cover and what we need to take another look at. But NCAP has a whole lot of fact sheets online for alternative pest solutions, and these are both for indoor and outdoor pest issues. And just kind of show you this page really quick. Anything here from ants to fleas to mosquitoes to rats. I mean, we have all sorts of fact sheets that can be consulted for non-chemical pest management indoors and outdoors. And a lot of this would be applicable to pests that you see in your schools. EPA has a great school IPM website, as does Oregon State University here, and they actually have a good Q&A sort of fact sheet for the school IPM law that covers the things that I covered. Definitely, it's a more kind of designed for your school staff, for IPM coordinators themselves as a kind of guidebook. It also has sample IPM plans, sample low impact pesticide lists, all kinds of staff training and outreach tools. And I'll make sure that I get a copy of the presentation to Bailey so that I can share this with you all and you can have the links to these resources. So I think these are great follow-up tools. I also want to mention that we have some videos online that talk specifically about school IPM for mice. And it's applicable really to rats as well for the most part, but it talks about sanitation and exclusionary practices, proper ways for trapping, ways to reduce harborage. All these kinds of things that I mentioned are detailed pretty much comprehensively in these videos, and they're all online too at sustainableplaces.org. So I just wanted to bring your attention to those. Any further questions? I mean, NCAP's always available to work with schools to try to help address pest issues or just work together to improve IPM protocols. Any of that kind of stuff is well within our mission, and We've been doing a lot of that with schools in Eugene and in the Portland and Beaverton area over the last few years, and so we want to make ourselves available. But I guess I'll open it up for questions now. I'm going to stop my screen share and see if I can see what we've got here in the chat.
And this is Bailey. I just unmuted everybody, so feel free to go ahead and ask questions. It looks like Sue Shade had a question for you in the chat.
Yeah, I'm looking at this. It says, does the IPM plan also need to address chemical use in landscaping? It does. I think something that I need to mention is that preventive or cosmetic uses of pesticides are not allowed under the school IPM law here in Oregon anymore. And a lot of landscaping uses of pesticides are kind of, traditionally they've been the routine calendar sprays where you put something down on the athletic fields, or you put something down to prevent weeds from emerging in your turf areas around campus. A lot of that stuff, there are some exceptions, but a lot of that stuff is no longer allowed. And so your IPM plan does need to include your tactics for managing your turf areas and your other outdoor areas around campus, and doing that with a minimum of chemical inputs. Another questions I see, is there anything specific that kitchens should be aware of, given that they probably attract pests because of the food? I think, I already emphasized the sealed container bit. That really makes a huge difference. I mean, all of your grains, all of your other kinds of dry goods that you keep on hand, most of the time, these things need to be stored in sealed containers. Other than that, really being diligent about sanitation sanitation is like 90% of IPM. If you can get to a point where pests, regardless of what they are, where they cannot get at food and water sources in your school, then that's really the majority of what you need to be doing. And so for kitchen areas, I guess there are other things like the door sweeps I mentioned, any kind of external doors or windows that open into your kitchen, making sure that those are well sealed. There are those air blades, I think, that you can store. A lot of grocery stores have them, where you come in and there's kind of a sheet of downwardly compressed air, that comes over the door frame. That tends to prevent flying insects and other things like that from coming in. Most of those are expensive, and I'm not sure if they're really within the scope of what a lot of schools would have in their budget, but it's something to consider. But yeah, sanitation is really the thing. Specific tips regarding the placement of the roll carts or other precautions for food composting and food waste. Mm-hmm. Keeping them away from the building, I think that the recommendation is actually to have them something like 35 to 50 feet away from the building at least. And that can be difficult. I've been to some schools where they just don't even have that much space. And so what I tend to recommend is just if you've got dumpsters, any kind of compost bins, anything where there is food waste being stored on a regular basis, you want that as far away from your building as possible, because it will attract pests, and if they're close to your building, they're eventually going to make their way in one way or another. The other thing that you can do with these is just to clean them regularly. Hose them out once in a while. Most dumpsters have drain holes and things like that at the bottom. You can put screens over that, just wire mesh or the kind of like the Brillo pad type material. They make materials specifically for excluding rodents from dumpsters and other kinds of containers like that that they can't chew through. And I think it's made of copper or something a little bit heavier than the Brillo pad material. But screening up those drain holes or covering them in some way to prevent mice from entering and exiting the dumpster, that can go a long way as well. So I would encourage that. Another question for notification of, if you're planning a pesticide application, what are the requirements for giving or posting notice around that? I think I actually printed those out anticipating that we'd get that question. Oh, maybe I didn't. It has to be written notification, and that can be several different things. It can be a notice via letter to students or their parents. It can be on the school's website. It can be a combination of those things. I think it actually has to be posted to the area where the application is going to take place via signage. So really, the more that you can do with regard to notification is the better. Making sure that people are aware that a pesticide is going to be applied. Posting the reentry period, which that varies based on what the chemical is, but you want to be very good about giving people all of that information. And I would encourage to err on the side of giving them more than what is necessary, as opposed to giving them maybe not all the things that they need to know. How much involvement or assistance should a school ask from their garbage hauler to address pest problems with a food scrap program? I think it's a good topic to bring up with them. I'm not sure, really. I mean, it would really depend on the specifics of the situation and what specific needs you had. But I mean, if you have someone who comes and retrieves your compost and removes it from site, like if that's an example, talking to them about optimizing or maybe increasing their pickup rate. It could be as simple. I mean, if you have someone who comes and tends compost, making sure that the compost piles are covered really well, that there's a good mix of stuff in there. There's things like alfalfa and other things like that you can actually add to compost, which not only increases the quality of the compost, but I think there's some kind of pest deterrent properties that certain things have just naturally. And when you add those to compost, you can do a pretty good job of preventing things like gnats and sugar flies and those pests that tend to be attracted to rotting food. So I would just talk to them about strategies maybe along those lines to see what assistance they could give you, to see what advice they could give you, and maybe take it from there. I'm not seeing any further questions, so I guess I'll thank you again. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you all about this. Again, our information, I'll get that to Bailey so that you have a copy of the presentation. My email address, it can be reached through info@pesticide.org. So if you have follow-up questions or anything that you want to chat more about, you feel free to get in touch with us directly here at NCAP.
Thank you very much, Josh. It's a great presentation.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was thinking that for us that start recycling programs and composting programs at schools, this is really important information for us to have, because sometimes we introduce something to a school that attracts some pests. Like I'm thinking about Capri Sun collection that I always hear attracts and flies like crazy. So it's really important to keep all of this in mind for those of us that start these programs, that prevention is a really huge piece of.
Well, and they're great programs, and we want schools to keep them, and so we want to make sure that they can do them without creating additional problems that might discourage them, so it's good.
It is.
Well, when Josh sends this information, we'll be putting it on the website, as well as these other resources that he was talking about with the templates and the training opportunities. And we are recording this, so hopefully the recording, we've never tried this before, but assuming that works well, we can share this recorded version as well. And then if you have people, I can think of several that I think would be great people to hear this information, you'll be able to at least send them the recorded version.
Definitely. So are there any further questions about IPM that we, or any discussion items those of you that are still on the line would like to chat about? If not, then we can move into the rest of our agenda. And if a question comes to mind, then please go ahead and ask it. I think we are all unmuted at this point. And I'm trying to see, still with us. looks like we have